Okay, tonight's mission, crisis communication. Although, let's be honest, my diet and my bank account are ongoing crises. Tabernacle. Okay, come on, Danny. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Sure. Okay, Podcastle, let's do this. Sora is probably waiting forever here. A quick sip of energy. And showtime.
The Community Lab. Your podcast that connects professional communication research, practice, and people.
Hi, and welcome to the Community Lab. I'm Danny, host and all-around jack of all trades behind the hottest knowledge transfer podcast on professional communication research and its practical applications. Thanks for tuning in to this episode on crisis communication and why managing reputation through prudent CSR communication is absolutely critical in tough times. To dig into this topic, I invited Professor Sora Kim from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Believe it or not, I first met Sora a few years ago in the Viennese vineyards, when Sabine, my former supervisor, brought her in for some guest lectures. Our conversations were smart and insightful, and let's be honest, the local wine didn't hurt either. In this lab talk, Sora and I explore what a crisis actually is and why it can also be an opportunity. We talk about why audience-centered communication is essential not just for managing but preventing crises, how CSR communication can be both a blessing and a curse, and why cultural context plays a major role when the pressure is on. So, switch from crisis to learning mode for the next hour and join me as we explore Sora's world of crisis and CSR communication and discover why a crisis might just be the communicative growth moment we didn't know we needed. Enjoy! Hi Sora! Welcome to the Community Lab. Thanks for gracing the show with your presence.
Thank you, Danielle, for inviting me. It's a great opportunity. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited too. Thank you, Sora. Before we talk about your path to becoming a communication scholar, I'll hand over to ChatGPT, which, as always, has prepared an introduction.
Okay.
So let's see what it has put together for you today.
Professor Sora Kim is a leading scholar in strategic communication at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. As a professor in the School of Journalism and Communication and director of the Corporate Communication Master's Program, she has significantly influenced the fields of corporate social responsibility and crisis communication. With over 130 publications in top-tier journals spanning communication, business, and management, Professor Kim's research delves into how organizations communicate during crises, the nuances of CSR messaging, and the impact of digital media on public perception. Her work has earned her numerous accolades, including the top paper award from the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication in 2021. Beyond academia, Professor Kim actively bridges the gap between research and practice, contributing to initiatives like the Corporate Communication Review, which aims to make scholarly insights accessible to communication professionals. ChatGPT thinks of Professor Kim as a globally respected expert whose research not only advances academic discourse, but also offers practical guidance for organizations navigating the complexities of modern communication challenges.
Wow, that's much better than I expected.
That's actually what I hear from every guest. Thanks, ChatGPT, for this great intro. But now I'm curious, Sora, what are your thoughts on the intro? Is there something missing? Is something outdated? Because sometimes that happens.
Yeah, sometimes it happens. Yeah, the publication number got changed.
Of course, yeah.
That's the incorrect one.
Mhm.
But all other things are much more exaggerated.
Of course.
than what I achieved. So it's actually a good introduction. I like it.
Okay, there you go. So ChatGPT, great work. Awesome. Okay, good. Let's move forward. Now that we've got a sense of who you are and what you bring to the table, let's take a step back and get to know the person behind the big or huge, impressive publication record. So I'm curious, how did you first find your way into the world of communication research? And was it a clear path or more of a winding road?
Okay. I actually started in journalism as a student reporter. And that experience sparked my interest in basically how media shapes public understanding. And later I worked as a marketing communication manager, handling PR, public relations, and advertising to manage corporate reputation. What really struck me during that time was that how so many global companies focused almost entirely on promoting their competence, like a product quality, how awesome their products are, but often ignored their broader social responsibilities. That disconnect stayed with me. So it made me wonder, what would it like if businesses communicated not just to sell, but to lead more responsibly? That question led me to pursue actually a PhD and eventually shape my research focus on CSR and crisis communication. So today, I guess I'm still driven by one central goal: to help businesses contribute to positive societal change by being truly responsible. And one core question: when does CSR communication really makes a difference? And how can it build lasting trust with stakeholders in both peace and crisis time?
Okay.
I guess that's probably the behind reasons.
Okay, so but I'm interested here. So why crisis in this context? So CSR makes perfect sense. How can companies or organizations of all kinds, lead? I would say like ethically, responsibly. But when or why did crisis come into the picture?
Okay, basically CSR. I mean, if you build a very strong reputation before the crisis hits, then that CSR can function as a buffer, insurance policy. Because when people have a very good feelings toward a company, then every organization has a crisis, right? And then every organization has to respond. And also when crisis hits, there's a definitely reputational damage. I mean, we can expect that. But the CSR with the good building reputation and good deeds, you can actually save. You can have an insurance policy so that when actually crisis hits, you can reduce the damage. So I actually look at how CSR can protect or even damage when it comes to crisis. So it's actually connected. So I'm looking at different types of reputation, how different types of reputation can damage or how recovering from crisis.
Okay, great. So we will talk about that later on a bit in detail, of course.
Yes.
But before we do that, I'm just curious. I'm always interested in how communication scholars look at communication in general. Just when you think of communication, beyond all the theories and the research, what does communication mean to you personally and also professionally? What role does it play in your communication activities, in your private life, and also your professional life? Are there differences how you approach communication, or is it the same actually?
Okay, yes. I guess to me, communication is fundamental. I guess to everybody else, pretty much the same, right? But one concept I find especially fascinating is communication is a receiver phenomenon. So you probably wonder, what is the receiver phenomenon?
Yeah, exactly.
So I often illustrate this in a very simple way. I'm going to ask you a question and try to make some communication with you. Daniel, 오늘 뭐 먹었어? 오늘 기분은 어때?
Buona notte. Buona notte, good night. Je ne comprends pas.
Daniel, did you understand what I just said?
I thought buona notte, but I'm pretty sure I'm wrong.
So, I mean, I can see when you heard what I said earlier, your eyes got bigger and look
Yeah,
confused, right?
true.
Basically, I said it in Korean,
Okay.
which means, what did you eat today, Danielle? What did you eat today? How are you feeling today? That was what I said.
Okay.
But no wonder you couldn't understand what I said, right?
Yeah.
My message was completely lost.
Mhm.
Even if I send a message with full intent. If the receiver doesn't understand the language, no real communication has occurred. So between you and me, there's no shared meaning. So this example underscores critical point. Communication is not about what the sender says, but about what the receiver understands. So for communication to be effective, it must be receiver-centered or audience-centered. So we need to use language, symbols, and messages that are relevant to our audience's experience, knowledge, and expectation. That's why understanding the audience, be it students or readers or stakeholders, is always the first step in any effective communication process. Of course, in professional context, especially in strategic communication, this principle becomes even more vital. You cannot communicate effectively with your stakeholders unless you understand what they expect, value, and care about. That's where empathy and active listening and engagement come into play. I also refer to the wisdom in the saying in terms of communication. Tell me and I will forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me, I will understand. That to me is the essence of communication. If we just tell somebody, they will forget. If we try to show them, they will at least remember. But if you're trying to involve them, they will understand. I think that's the essence of communication. So whether I'm teaching or working with students, I try to practice this principle. But of course, it's not easy. But in order to at least try to create my message that resonates and involves the audience rather than simply being delivered to them. So I think communication to me is that. I hope I explained it okay.
Cool. Thank you so much for your insights. That's great.
Good. Thank you.
So now that we know a little bit more about you, how you came into communication research and what communication means to you, let's zoom in on the core of your academic work. And as mentioned already, it's CSR communication, but also, of course, crisis communication. So communication when the stakes are high. So I would like to know, when researchers talk about crises, what exactly do they mean by that? And what role does communication play in helping organizations weather the storm?
Okay, so first I want to talk about from a scientific perspective what crisis is.
Exactly, that's very important.
Yes, crisis is basically defined as a sudden, unexpected event that threatens an organization's legitimacy, reputation, or operations. It's a situation marked by very high uncertainty and also require urgency and things like that, where decision must be made quickly and often with very much incomplete information. And where the outcomes can also profoundly affect stakeholders' trust and even organizational survival. So that's a just normal crisis definition. But crisis is fundamentally a matter of perception rather than objective reality. A lot of people may think crisis is reality. However, even if there's no actual crisis event, when stakeholders feel their expectation toward an organization is being violated, the organization is in crisis regardless of the fact, which means it's actually more of the perception issue rather than reality. Of course, reality may create perception, but even if there's no reality, if people perceive there's a crisis, that's a crisis. So crises are perceived violation of expectation.
Okay.
So the moments when people believe an organization has failed to meet social norms or ethical standards or their own expectation, So that is why even a relatively minor incident can escalate it into a full-blown reputational crisis if it contradicts what people believe the organization stands for. So perception of harm is what defines a crisis. I think this is where communication becomes absolutely central.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes. Communication during a crisis is not just about disseminating information. It's more about managing perception and reducing uncertainty and protecting public safety and rebuilding trust or relationships. So crisis communication itself is very strategic and multi-phased before, during, and after the crisis.
Yeah.
Before a crisis happened, for example, effective crisis communication helps manage the gap between an organization's actual performance and public expectation. That kind of public expectation can include reputation-related perception. There might be a gap, and issue-related perception and risk-related perception. Those perception management is also happen before crisis happen. Communication in this phase help build credibility and reduce the risk of a future crisis. Of course, during crisis, communication helps organization control the narratives.
Of course.
It combats misinformation, provides timely and constant updates.
Or provides misinformation.
Combats misinformation.
I'm just cynical.
I know, but yes, combats misinformation. That's one of also key roles. And also conveys the organization's sense of responsibility and empathy. And crisis communication is also very essential for reputation repair and relationship repair. What I observe is a lot of corporations pay more attention to their own reputation repair during or after crisis. However, more important communication during crisis is providing instructing information and adjusting information. Instructing information basically guides stakeholders on what to do to protect themselves. And adjusting information is also addressing emotional needs of stakeholders by recognizing the situation and expressing care and concern and commitment to resolution. So that part is very core ethical responsibility in terms of crisis communication. But governments tend to pay more attention to that aspect, but corporations, they tend to neglect those aspects. Instead, they focus on, we need to repair our damaged reputation. We need to recover our relationship management. So after crisis subsides, of course, communication again plays a long-term role in terms of learning and organizational resilience. So like transparent communication about lesson learned and structural reforms and ethical reflection, that's also very important. I think crisis is more than an operational failure. It is a communicative event that either damage or rebuild stakeholder relationships. So communication is not simply a supporting function in crisis management. It is the core mechanism through which meaning is negotiated and trust is restored and recovery becomes possible. So I think that's how I view crisis.
So it seems like that you see it as a resource almost. So something an organization can learn from and thrive.
Yes. Crisis can be an opportunity and also very much threats. Depending on how you look at things, the threats can change into opportunity. So you need to utilize things already happen. Then you need to think about how to change this threat situation into an opportunity to find existing problems and then change the situations so that you got better. I think it applies to individual as well. Like if we experience something, we learn from it and we become a better person. Same thing for an organization.
I like this positive approach to crisis. So I like that. One of your key research areas, of course, is CSR communication, as we already know. And you say that CSR communication affects an organization's reputation during a crisis. Of course, we covered that already. In this context, you distinguish between two types of crisis that are especially relevant in this context. So could you break that down and explain what kinds of crisis you're talking about here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. What I found is that not all reputations or crises are created equal. So in order to explain two types of crisis, I need to explain, first, corporate reputation types. Let me start by break down two key types of corporate reputation. One is corporate ability reputation. The other one is CSR reputation.
Okay.
Think of CA reputation as a company being known for doing its core business really well, making great products, delivering excellent services, that sort of thing. CSR reputation, on the other hand, is about being recognized for doing good, like supporting communities, protecting environment, or treating workers fairly. Then, when a crisis hits, let's face it, they always do, right? It tests the strengths and types of reputation a company has built. So this is where things getting interesting. My research focusing on two broad types of crisis: product-related crisis and ethics-related crisis. Some people actually, sometimes I use, instead of product-related crisis, I use a CA crisis. And ethics crisis, I use CSR crisis. So product-related crisis is basically involve issues like faulty products, safety recalls, and problem ties to company's ability to deliver what it promised. Ethics-related crises are more about business ethics and values. This involves things like labor violation, corruptions, environmental scandal, areas where CSR comes to play. The kind of reputation a company has can either cushion, buffer the blow, or actually to make the crisis worse, depending on the type of reputation. So I use something called expectancy violation theory to explain this. It basically says that people form expectation based on what a company is known for. When a company violates those expectations, the backlash can be even severe. Take a company that's famous for high quality products. For example, CA reputation, strong CA reputation the company has. But if it faces a product recall, consumers feel like, wait a minute, I expected better. And that disappointment hits harder. On the flip side, if a company is known for being socially responsible, which means it has a strong CSR reputation, but then gets caught up in an ethics scandal, people feel betrayed because the company didn't just mess up. It broke a moral promise. My research found CSR reputation can actually help companies more in product-related crisis than CA reputation can. Why? Two reasons. First, if you have a strong CSR reputation and you don't have such a strong CA reputation, then the reason why is that people don't expect CSR-focused company to be perfect at everything. So if there's a product issue, the violation of expectation is smaller because at the beginning, they didn't expect that, they didn't have that high expectation toward the product related. So the fallout isn't as intense because people didn't necessarily expect them to be best-in-class manufacturers. And another reason is there is this sense of a broader societal forgiveness. When a company is seen as doing good, people are often more willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's like a goodwill in the bank. So they may have a stumble, but their past good deeds buy them a bit of grace. However, the same CSR reputation can backfire much more in an ethics-related crisis. I just said CSR reputation can buffer damage during product-related crisis, but the same CSR reputation can even more backfire in an ethics-related crisis. It's because if a company has built brands around being ethical and socially conscious, and then it's caught up something that contradicts that reputation, then the sense of betrayal is much deeper. People feel let down, and the reputational damage can actually be worse than if the company had no strong reputation to begin with. So that was what my research found. So there are this is the dynamics of reputation and how it's related to crisis management. So there are some takeaways. You can use CSR, build a strong CSR, and use CSR as a buffer for product crisis. So if you're in an industry where product issues are very likely, building a strong CSR reputation can act like crisis insurance. Of course, it won't eliminate the damage.
Yeah, of course.
But it can soften the blow. Another takeaway is manage expectation carefully. Whether your company is known for its product quality or its ethics, make sure you're not overpromising. High expectations mean there's a long way to fall if something goes wrong. And you need to know your strengths. The companies need to know their strengths. Find out where your reputation is strongest. Is it in your technical ability, CA, or your social responsibility? That should guide where you put more crisis prevention efforts. If you have a strong CSR reputation, then you will have to put more prevention efforts for ethics-related crisis because it can hit you harder. Conversely, if you have a strong CA reputation, then you will have to be more cautious of a product-related crisis by putting a lot of more prevention efforts. It is because bigger expectation violations result in definitely bigger damage. And aligns words with action. Of course, your message has to match what you can realistically deliver. When there is a mismatch, when people feel misled or disappointed, that's when the real damage is done.
No, fascinating. It's very, very interesting. Very interesting.
Thanks.
You do so much research when it comes to crisis communication, but also one of the contexts you're very interested in is social media in times of crisis.
Right.
For example, I found one study where you investigated the social media behavior and you saw that chasing likes and shares, what I don't know if you termed it that way, but you called it bandwagon cues. Like this chasing for that can backfire.
Correction, I didn't coin it. It's existing research.
There you go.
Yes.
So I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit more about that? So because I'm pretty sure our listeners are very interested in that.
Absolutely. This is a topic I find very fascinating because we often think of social media engagement like likes and shares and retweets as a positive thing, especially for companies. But in the context of a crisis, my research shows that high social media engagement can actually fuel public outrage and push people to demand even government regulation. So before social media era, only those corporate crises that cause very severe casualties would take on salience in the public domain. But today, a corporate crisis, regardless of actual levels of severities, may provoke debates on social media and raise societal level concerns and mature into very much high-profile social issues. So let me start with the concept bandwagon cues.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, these are the visible signs of a popularity. Again, this one is not the terms that I coined. Somebody else's. I forgot. I think it's
someone.
Yeah, someone. Yeah, these are the visible signs of popularity on social media. Things like number of likes, shares, and comments a post gets. So people naturally assume that if a post has gone viral, it must be important or true. So they start paying more attention, even if the actual content isn't new or particularly damaging. So now in a corporate crisis, say a data leak or sexual harassment scandal, when a social media post gets a lot of engagement, it creates what I call a perception spiral. People see that others are upset which makes them feel the issue must be serious, even if they didn't know about the crisis before. This leads them to perceive crisis as more severe than they might have otherwise. This phenomenon is due to a biased statistical sense of crisis information on social media, because it's a lot of engagement and numbers, right? But which result in, usually in crisis time, overestimated crisis severity. Why does that matter? Because when people think a crisis is severe, they start pointing fingers. This is where another core concept in my study comes in, of course, responsibility attribution. This is about who people believe should be blamed and held accountable. So we found that people don't just blame the company. They also blame the broader societal system that allow the problem to happen. So they also blame societal system. So here's how it all connects. A viral post with lots of bandwagon cues makes people think crisis is more severe, and this leads them to blame both the company and society at large, and ultimately they demand regulatory intervention. This means government action, new laws, or public policies to prevent it from happening again. So to put it simply, social media virality can transform a corporate crisis into a public policy issue. So we tested all of these through large-scale experiments in China. The first used a real-life case about a company called Ctrip and its data leakage crisis. And second one, we used fictitious company facing a sexual harassment scandal. In both studies, posts with high bandwagon cues led to stronger public demand for regulation. What's even more interesting is that we also look at how the content of the post itself, specifically the post, who it blames, affects people's reaction. These are called crisis blame frames. So some posts blame the company directly. Other posts blamed society or systematic issues. So what we found was that when the post already blames the society, bandwagon cues have an even stronger impact on getting people to also blame society and getting people to also demand regulatory change. So the combination of a viral popularity and blame framing is particularly powerful. What does this matter for companies? Because once the crisis reached that viral tipping point, it's not just about protecting your brand reputation anymore. You might be looking at calls for new government regulation. So in countries like China, where the public tends to rely on government to step in, this becomes especially important. Once people start calling for legal or policy change, companies have to deal with both a reputational crisis and potential new laws or penalty. So for crisis manager in China, there are a few takeaways. They need to monitor virus signals early enough, because if a crisis post is gaining traction quickly, don't just look at what it says. You need to look at how fast it's spreading. Virality itself is a warning sign. And be aware of a blame framing. Posts that frame the issue as a systematic failure can fuel even broader public anger and regulatory demand, especially if they go viral. And you need to act fast. Once a crisis picks up and shared widely, people start to see it not just as a company issue, but as a societal issue. So if you don't address it quickly and transparently, the damage can escalate beyond your control. You need to understand, basically. Public perception can be shaped not just by what is said, but by how many people are saying it and how publicly visible that attention is. That visibility can push crisis into the domain of public policy making. That's where things get really serious for companies.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And it's a very good bridge to my last question about your research in general. And it's about cultural sensitivity in crises.
Right.
So I'm curious, many companies, multinational corporations, they operate across borders, of course. And so cultural sensitivity is very critical, especially in times of crisis. What have you learned about how cultural norms shape crisis communication on a global scale?
Yeah, that's actually such a great question. Honestly, it's one of the biggest challenges global companies face today. We tend to think crisis as universal. Something goes wrong, a company responds, but in reality, the public expectation or their emotional reactions or even reputational outcomes vary dramatically across cultures.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest takeaways from my research is this: cultural context fundamentally changes how people even perceive, react to, and judge corporate behavior in crisis.
Yeah.
So in one of my studies, I and my students examined what we call, the online firestorms. Basically, those sudden massive surges of a public criticism that erupt on social media. So we compare how these firestorms unfold on Twitter. Now it's called X in the US, and Weibo in China. Weibo is equivalent to Twitter.
Yeah.
What we found was very fascinating. Basically, we found very striking cultural differences between US and China. In the US, when it comes to online firestorm, users are much more likely to target political institutions and political figures. And they express outrage with humor, mockery, or through collective activism like boycotts. Well, aligning with Western norms around individual expression is important and political critique is allowed, and basically free speech, right? But in China, where political critique is more restricted, users channel their anger instead toward corporations and celebrities, because they cannot really blame governments, right? So they tend to avoid direct government criticisms. Instead, they pour their anger toward corporations and celebrities, but especially where the perceived violation of ethics or social responsibility happen. And also, they emphasize harmony, morality, and social expectation much more. So if you're an American company operating in China, you need to pay more attention to ethical responsibility, social values, and moral integrity before and after a crisis. Another research I did, remember during COVID-19, there was a lot of consumer panicking. The hoarding behaviors happened in the US and a lot of other countries, right? So what we explored was how media exposure, like social media versus legacy media, impacted consumer hoarding behavior in the US versus China. What we found, some differences. In the US, seeking information via social media actually increased consumer hoarding, which makes sense because social media content is more emotional and chaotic, even fear-inducing, right? With the viral image of empty shelves and panic, they triggered more consumer anxiety and made people rush to stock up. Makes sense. But in China, social media actually had the opposite impact.
Okay.
It reduced the hoarding behavior. Why?
Yeah, how come?
Because Chinese social media is more regulated. And during the crisis, both legacy and social platforms tend to deliver more stable and government-aligned messagings aimed at maintaining social order and minimizing fear. So that's why it happened. And another interesting thing was that Chinese consumers only hoarded more when they're exposed to legacy media messages, but the messages should emphasize supply chain issues. So which means only when they believed the shortage was due to supply failure, not because of the high demand. So when people think, shortage happened because of supply chain issues, and then that thing was reported via legacy media, then they hoard more because they trust legacy media. Another one is, again, COVID-19, CSR donations made by prominent corporate figures like Bill Gates and Jack Ma. They donated, Jack Ma donated, and Bill Gates donated. So we look at how such donations, CSR donations, impact the company's reputation and even country's reputation. Yeah. And also the leader themselves. What we found actually positive ripple effect. So which means when people are aware of these donations, their perception of corporate figure improved, which then boosted company's reputation and ultimately influenced their perception of the leader's home country. So at the time between China and the US, it's still very strong tension, right? Even if in such a situation, when Chinese look at Bill Gates' donations, they actually evaluate them much better. Reputation goes up. So, however, the cultural norms again shaped how people judge the motives behind the CSR during COVID-19. Americans are more willing to accept that donations might have a self-serving motives, which means they're helping it, but at the same time, they wanted to boost their image and their market trust. That's why they're doing it. But even if they recognize that, they're willing to accept and still rewarding them reputationally. But Chinese consumers, on the other hand, strongly prefer to see altruistic motives, like genuine concern for public welfare. They were less forgiving when they suspected the CSR actions was done for publicity. I think if you are a global brand facing a crisis, don't just ask, what should we say? Ask instead, who are we speaking to? What do they value? How do they interpret responsibility and sincerity? That's the key to resonate globally and recovering reputational wise.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I totally agree. Hopefully you'll stay on track and do more research in this context. So because I find it very fascinating and it's so timely in this globalized world, of course.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
Now, in general, when you look at all your research you have done, and it's a variety, it's awesome. But when you break it down and you have now two audiences in front of you, you have a meeting and one person is a communication professional and the other person is like, let's say a leader, let's say a CEO. What advice would you give them separately when it comes to crisis communication?
Okay, so let me start with the communication professional. I will recommend, key advice to them is build the CSR knowledge before the crisis, not during it. One of the biggest findings from my research is the CSR efforts generate reputational value only when people know about them. It's not enough to quietly do good. Public need to be aware of your social contribution and they need to believe in your sincerity. This is where many organizations fall into what we call the CSR communication dilemma. The fear that promoting CSR will be seen as self-serving or seen as increasing consumer skepticism. Because of that, they don't do it. But our research shows that well-strategized and value-based storytelling, especially when delivered by credible figures, third-party, can boost both trust and preparedness. Build the CSR knowledge before the crisis. And the second one, I guess, tailor your CSR communication to cultural expectation in times of a crisis, post-crisis and before crisis. Use CSR to define your brand moral identity. That will help for preparing crisis. For the CEOs, for CEOs communicating, I guess, humanize the crisis response. This also applies to communication professional as well. CEOs need to humanize the crisis response, show empathy, not just the authority. I think that's really important. People don't just want information. They want reassurance that leadership understand their fear, anger, or confusion. So leaders' actions can shape public perception of both corporate and national reputation, as we saw from our research.
Mm-hmm.
So CEOs, the message shouldn't just be we are addressing the problem, but also we understand how this affects you. We care.
Yeah.
And we're committed to doing what's right. This kind of empathetic leadership, when you're dealing with external stakeholders and when you're dealing with internal, then inclusive leadership, those are very critical. Especially, I think it's universal, but especially also collective cultures, because collective cultures, CEO authority matters more.
Mm-hmm.
In the West, the CEO maybe doesn't have to appear in front of camera when crisis happens. But in Eastern cultures, they expect the top authority comes out and share.
Mm-hmm.
The emotional alignment with the public is often seen as a sign of a moral leadership. So humanize your response.
Mm-hmm.
And also the CEO need to aware of your cultural context. One CEO message doesn't fit all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the US, people expect openness, accountability, even vulnerability from CEOs.
Mm-hmm.
So a public apology or a behind-the-scene video or even unscripted messages can enhance authenticity.
Mm-hmm.
But in China, for example, CEO is expected to maintain composure, moral authority, and harmony.
Okay.
So messaging should be respectful, collectivistic in tone, and coordinated with institutional or government guidance.
Mm-hmm.
So some of in Asian countries, the government guidance, especially in China, that's important. So the CEOs leading international companies, I think, must adopt their tone and framing and visibility based on local cultural norms.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they risk appearing out of touch or worse, disrespectful.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much. And while you were talking, I have just one message that popped up. Is like, don't do it like Elon Musk. I think that's the best advice you can give for CEOs,
yes.
right?
Oh, yeah. That's a one line. Yes, of course.
Thanks for talking about your research and, of course, the practical applications. So before we wrap up, though, I would like to take a look at your academic crystal ball, so to speak. I'm curious, what ideas, questions, or challenges are currently sparking your curiosity?
Oh my God, thanks for asking. I'm really excited about my research directions. I tried to pick, but I have two main directions.
Mm-hmm.
And the first area is basically, I already started this. Both of the project is ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
So the first area is basically focusing on how companies are navigating increasingly complex space between CSR and CSA, corporate social advocacy. I know you covered CSA before, but I wanted to talk a little more about this because it's different.
Yeah.
The line between the two is becoming, I think from my observation, the line between CSR and CSA is becoming more blurry.
Mm-hmm.
Even traditionally non-controversial CSR activities like sustainability, even diversity programs can now spark political backlash.
Mm-hmm.
Because of that, companies are adopting very different communication strategies. I've been observing that. Some are choosing strategic silence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some people call it green hushing, but I named this social hushing.
Okay.
Social hushing instead of green hushing. It's because in order to cover broader societal, responsibility issues. So social hushing is basically where they downplay or even hide their ESG or CSR sustainability efforts to just avoid criticism.
Mm-hmm.
But some other companies are withdrawing from long-standing social commitments. I've been observing it, while a few are standing firm and publicly affirming their values related to CSR. So I'm studying how these varied responses from silence to strong standing firm impact public trust and corporate reputation.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I'm doing like two separate experiments.
Mm-hmm.
For doing it, I'm actually developing a new concept called social license to influence.
Okay, sounds fancy.
Yeah, I know. Social license to influence, which means it builds on the idea of social license to operate.
Mm-hmm.
there was a social license to operate concept, but I changed it to social license to influence, which means do people trust a company enough to let it speak out on social issues? So depending on how much people allow companies to speak up and also make social changes, so how different level of this license shape public interpretation of a company's response.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I'm exploring how different levels of this license, social license to influence, shape public interpretation of a company's response, whether it stays silent, social hushing, or take a stand.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one big project that I'm working on. The other one is examining social media platforms during disasters,
Okay.
particularly natural disasters and climate-related events. I'm looking at how the platforms can act more responsibly, not just by flagging false information, but by doing in ways that genuinely build public interest.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm testing how different types of warning labels, that a lot of platforms adopted warning labels. So saying this might contain misinformation or things like that, right? So we call it warning labels. So it's a social media platform affordances. So how different types of warning labels in times of disasters, for example, whether they are generated by AI fact checkers or human fact checkers, because some social media platforms adopt AI fact checkers and some are adopting human fact checkers. So depending on that, are there any differences in terms of public perception or their coping behavior? And also whether the message is framed directly or indirectly. So it's a framing I'm looking at. So direct framing is basically, this contains misinformation. This is not true, kind of very direct framing versus this may contain misinformation. So does that also make a difference in terms of people's perception of a platform social responsibility and also their public scoping behavior during disasters?
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. We have to wrap up, and we do that always with our much beloved yet dreaded quickfire round.
Yeah, dreaded quickfire round. So I'm scared.
You don't have to be. It's just 5 rapid questions, 5 spontaneous answers, but no overthinking allowed. Are you game?
Okay, ready.
The quick fire round.
What's something you recently tried for the first time that you don't want to do again?
Well, I always dyed my hair totally white color, like pink, maybe even icy white, but instead I chicken out. And because I was too worried about damaging my hair and everything, so I compromised. I bought a wig instead.
Really?
Yeah, I know. So it turned out to be a little too shiny. Let's say just it's not natural looking. So that plan didn't quite work out either. So I'm not gonna do it again.
If you had to explain your research to someone using only a metaphor, what would it be?
Metaphor. I don't know. That's a tough question. I don't know. It's like a rainbow. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can use rainbow.
Yes, rainbow. I love rainbow. And I have a different color. It's all connected though. So I think my research is 2 main streams. And it looked like, it's actually centralized into my 2 core research interests. It comes out as a different color, having different shapes. But in essence, it's actually one.
If you weren't an academic, what job would you be secretly curious to try for 1 year?
Only for 1 year. Okay, I want to be a drama writer.
Okay. How come? Why?
I absolutely love watching TV dramas. I'm not really into super realistic or gritty dramas. I prefer the kind that let me escape.
What's an everyday object you're strangely attached to and why?
Everyday object, my cell phone.
Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
My cell phone is strangely attached, but only for, especially every day I do one thing. There's a walking app.
Okay.
So I usually try to walk at least 5,000 steps and then check and get very small coin. And that's one thing. And the other one is I do Duolingo. I'm not sure whether I can say the name.
Duolingo, it's totally fine.
Duolingo, you know that, right? I do at least one lesson every day.
Which language?
Mandarin. So I am learning it very slow. But at least when I traveled to Taiwan recently, I can actually speak Mandarin and communicate, at least purchasing and ordering,
That's
and
good,
even
man.
on street. So it actually, because of, thanks to Duolingo. So I'm attached to my phone.
Which crisis communication myth would you love to debunk once and for all?
Say nothing is safest option. Silence equals neutrality. I hate that.
Okay.
And then a lot of people think staying and saying nothing will help a company avoid controversy in a crisis. And then time goes by, it'll go away. But that's not true. I think the organization need to find what to say. Always try to find and explain. They have obligation to explain that to their stakeholders. So not saying it is not ethical, I think.
Okay, good. Yeah, that was the quick fire round.
Oh, no, it's all done? Okay.
No. So that was the 5 questions. Thank you so much. So it's always fun. At least I have fun. And that's the most important thing here, of course.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it very much. I hope I didn't bore you.
Not at all.
And also because it's night, late night, your time. So it's actually early, my time. So
Yeah, lucky you, bad for me. But this is like a 13 hours time difference, right? So
right, exactly.
it's quite late here already and it was a long day. However, I want to say thank you so much for joining the show. It was so insightful, and I'm so happy and so glad that you were willing to share this with not only with me, but also with the listeners. I appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much, Sora, for joining us.
No, I appreciate it a lot.
I would say, I think I'm going to go to bed soon.
Yes, have a good night. Thanks for having me. I had a great time.
Yeah, me too. Then thank you so much. Take care and sayonara. No, that's the wrong language, right?
Sayonara is Japanese. In Korean, 안녕.
Annyeong.
In Chinese, 再见.
Oh, now it's getting complicated. Okay, annyeong and chai-chen.
Yeah. Oh my God, you're better in Korean. Yeah, annyeong is perfect. Annyeong is perfect.
Let's say annyeong.
Annyeong.
That's easier a bit.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
That was the Lab Talk with Sora Kim. As always, I hope you took something valuable from today's episode. Personally, I learned that recording a podcast interview around 11 p.m. is something I'll try to avoid moving forward. Apparently, I'm getting old. We also learned that crisis communication isn't just about conveying messages. It's about engaging stakeholders and using communication to actually improve ourselves and the world around us. We discovered that overpromising in the realm of CSR and sustainability can seriously backfire during ethics-related crises. And surprisingly, we found out that too many likes and shares on corporate social media can trigger government regulation during a crisis. So, going viral isn't always a win. Just saying. If you want to dive deeper into crisis communication, CSR, and reputation management, check out the references handpicked by Sora in the show description. Follow the Community Lab on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podcastle. Subscribe on YouTube and smash the notification bell so you never miss a Lab Talk. If you're enjoying what you hear, show us some love with a like or a 5-star rating. It really helps feed the algorithm gods. We are also on LinkedIn, so Feel free to connect, share your thoughts, or recommend guests and topics to help this podcast keep growing and getting better. In the last episode before a well-deserved summer break, I'll be joined by Professor Boris Brumans from the University of Montreal, or Université de Montréal. We will explore mindful organizing, the power of communication in shaping mindful organizational life, and how practitioners can apply ethnographic methods to better understand and improve their own and organizational practices. Until next time, and don't forget, communication is everywhere. It's in what you say, what you don't, and sometimes even in the most awkward military meets birthday parade disaster in history. It's the little things that make you smile. Stay curious and keep the conversation alive.